Daniel Ford once believed that saving lives was the most meaningful thing in the world. The rush of battling against time, the satisfaction of bringing someone back from the brink of death. He had dedicated his entire life to that purpose. He was an exceptional doctor, committed, precise, and fearless in the face of chaos. Every shift he fought to keep his patients alive, doing everything in his power to beat the odds. Until one night when everything he believed in came crashing down. That night, an emergency case was rushed into the trauma bay. A man riddled with bullets, barely clinging to life. He had been shot multiple times in a police standoff. Blood loss was severe, internal injuries catastrophic. Daniel and his team worked relentlessly trying to stabilize him, but despite their best efforts, the man succumbed to his wounds. What Daniel didn't know was that the patient wasn't just anyone. He was a member of one of the city's most feared gangs. The moment he was pronounced dead, everything spiraled out of control. Within hours, gang members gathered outside the hospital, shouting accusations, blaming the doctors for letting their man die. "You let him die on purpose," they screamed, their anger spilling over into threats. Hospital security struggled to keep them at bay, but the tension inside the building was palpable. Then came the death threats. At first, Daniel brushed them off. "People will move on," security assured him. But they didn't. Through it all, Dr. Emily Carter, his closest friend and colleague, stood by him. She had always been his voice of reason, his anchor. "This will pass," she told him. "You did your job. You did everything you could." She tried to make him believe that the truth would prevail, that people would forget. But neither of them realized how far things would go. A few nights later, Daniel and Emily were at his apartment, talking about the ongoing threats. Daniel was exhausted, worn down by the constant scrutiny. Emily tried to reassure him, insisting that things would eventually blow over. But then, it happened. A sudden crash shattered the night. The sound of breaking glass. Before they could react, masked gunmen stormed in. Daniel barely had time to register what was happening before one of them raised a gun. His heart pounded. He recognized them. They were from the gang, the same men who had been outside the hospital. And they were here for revenge. Emily reached for her phone, her fingers barely brushing the screen. A gunshot rang out. Daniel froze. His ears were ringing. Emily collapsed to the floor. Blood pooled around her as she struggled to breathe. He dropped to his knees beside her, pressing his hands against the wound. "Emily, stay with me," he whispered, his voice shaking. But deep down he already knew. He had seen this before. The way life drained from someone's eyes. The way death came in quiet, irreversible moments. The gang had made their statement. They had sent their message. As they walked out, one of them turned back and sneered, "You got what you deserved. Stay in this city and we'll be back for more." Then they were gone. Daniel sat there, drenched in his best friend's blood, unable to move. He had spent years saving lives. And now, the one life that mattered most to him was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do. That was the moment everything changed. He had always believed that being a doctor meant making a difference, that life was worth fighting for. But now, what was the point? He had fought, he had given everything, and still it had ended like this. The guilt consumed him. If he had done things differently, could he have saved Emily? Could he have avoided all of this? He couldn't live with those questions. So he left. He walked away from the life he had built, from the city that had turned against him, from the career that no longer made sense. He disappeared into the mountains, settling in an isolated cabin, far from people, far from the past. Every morning he woke up to silence. And every morning the same thought haunted him. Could I have done more? The mountain air was sharp and cold as Daniel stepped onto the porch of his cabin. Snow stretched endlessly across the forest, untouched and pristine, except for a few scattered footprints leading to his truck. It was a quiet life, one without purpose. But it was the life he had chosen. It had been 2 years since he left everything behind. 2 years of isolation, of avoiding people, of trying to forget. Every morning he told himself that this was enough. Then why did it never feel that way? Daniel exhaled, pushing the thought aside, and turned on his old radio. Static crackled before a familiar voice came through. A severe winter storm is approaching. Heavy snowfall and high winds are expected. Residents should stock up on supplies and avoid traveling once the storm hits. Daniel frowned, glancing at his half-empty pantry. If this storm lasted longer than expected, he'd run out of food and water. He had no choice, he needed to go into town. Grabbing his truck keys, he climbed into the driver's seat and headed down the winding, snow-covered road toward Blackwood. The town and unwelcome stares. Blackwood was a quiet town. A place where people stayed in their routines and outsiders were noticed instantly. Daniel had never tried to fit in. When he walked into the general store, he felt the same curious stares as always. The locals didn't know much about him, only that he lived alone in the woods and rarely spoke. He moved quickly through the aisles, grabbing canned goods, bottled water, coffee, enough to last at least a week. At the counter, Maggie, the store's owner, gave him a knowing look. "Storm's rolling in fast," she said as she rang up his items. "Might be best to stay in town till it passes." Daniel shook his head. "I'll manage." Maggie sighed but didn't press further. He paid, took his bags and walked out into the bitter cold. The sky had darkened considerably in the short time he'd been inside. Snow was falling faster, the wind picking up strength. He needed to get home before things got worse. The crash. As Daniel drove up the winding mountain road, visibility worsened. Snow pelted his windshield, making it harder to see the narrow path ahead. Then, headlights appeared through the thick snowfall. A black SUV was coming toward him from the opposite direction, moving far too fast for the icy conditions. Suddenly, the vehicle swerved violently. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel as he watched, heart pounding. The SUV's tires skidded across the frozen road. It veered sharply to the right, then jerked back left, trying to correct. Then he saw it. A large deer stood in the middle of the road, frozen in place. The driver must have seen it at the last second. Instead of hitting the animal, they overcorrected, losing all control. The SUV spun, its back end fishtailing wildly before slamming into the guardrail. Metal groaned under the impact. For a second it seemed to hold. Then the SUV tipped over the edge and disappeared down the snowy slope. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Then he heard the scream. A woman's voice, frantic, terrified. "Lily." Daniel didn't think. He just moved. Slamming the brakes, he threw the truck into park, grabbed his coat and bolted toward the wreckage. The SUV had landed at an angle against the slope, half buried in the snow. One of the front windows was shattered. Through the broken glass he saw the driver. A woman, dazed, blood trickling down her forehead. But she wasn't screaming for herself. She was screaming for someone else. Daniel's gaze snapped to the back seat. The child's car seat was empty. The door beside it was wide open. His stomach twisted. The crash had thrown the child from the car. His eyes darted across the snowy landscape, searching. There. A small disturbance in the snow, leading away from the wreck. Somewhere out there in the freezing night, a little girl was lost. And she didn't have much time. The cold wind howled through the trees, whipping snow across Daniel's face as he ran toward the wreckage. The SUV lay on its side, half buried in the snow. The metal frame was bent from the impact, the windshield cracked in a spiderweb pattern. Through the shattered driver's side window, Daniel spotted a woman slumped forward against the steering wheel. Blood streaked down her temple. He climbed down the icy slope, boots sinking into the thick snow. Reaching the SUV, he crouched down and knocked on the broken window. The woman stirred, blinking dazedly before her gaze snapped to him. "Lily," she gasped. Daniel's stomach tightened. She wasn't calling for help for herself. His eyes darted to the back seat. The child's car seat was empty, the door beside it swung wide open. Dread settled deep in his chest. The impact must have thrown the child from the vehicle. The woman, Victoria, he assumed, tried to turn but winced in pain. "Please. My daughter," she was in the back seat. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Stay here. I'll find her." Turning away from the wreck, he scanned the snow-covered ground. The thick white blanket stretched out endlessly, untouched, except for one thing. A small red shape. His pulse spiked as he sprinted toward it. Half buried in the snow, Lily's tiny body lay motionless. Dropping to his knees beside her, he brushed away the snow covering her face. Her skin was deathly pale, lips tinged blue from the cold. His fingers pressed against her neck. A pulse. Weak but there. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Without wasting another second, he scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. Her small frame was ice-cold against his skin. "You're okay, kid," he murmured, voice barely audible over the wind. "You're gonna be okay." Daniel carried Lily back toward the wreck, his movements quick but careful. Victoria's frantic eyes locked onto them the moment he came into view. Is she? She's alive, Daniel assured her. But she's freezing. We need to get her warm. Lily's small body barely stirred in his arms. He needed to act fast. Daniel opened the back door of his truck, laying Lily across the seat. Ripping off his coat, he wrapped it around her, then reached for the spare blanket he kept in the truck. The wind howled louder, shaking the trees as the storm worsened. Snow was falling in thick sheets now, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I need to get you both out of here, Daniel said, turning back toward Victoria. But there was a problem. Her leg was pinned beneath the crushed metal of the dashboard. Daniel cursed under his breath. He didn't have time for this. Can you move at all? He asked. Victoria shook her head, teeth chattering from the cold. Daniel tried the door. It wouldn't budge. The impact had twisted the frame. Grinding his jaw, he climbed onto the wreckage, bracing his foot against the SUV's bent frame. With both hands he yanked at the door. It groaned but didn't move. A gust of wind nearly knocked him off balance. Time was running out. Victoria was barely holding on. Lily needed warmth. And the storm was only getting worse. The storm was getting worse. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, and the wind howled through the trees, rattling branches like skeleton fingers. Daniel barely felt the cold anymore. His focus was locked on the wrecked SUV, and the woman still trapped inside. Lily was in his truck, wrapped in blankets, her tiny body slowly regaining warmth. But Victoria, she wasn't going anywhere unless he got that damn door open. Daniel climbed onto the side of the SUV, bracing himself against the tilted frame. The metal groaned under his weight as he grabbed the crushed door handle and pulled with everything he had. Nothing. He adjusted his grip and yanked again, his muscles straining. The door didn't move. Victoria coughed, her breath shaky. I'm stuck. My leg. Daniel looked inside. Her right leg was pinned beneath the crushed dashboard. The force of the crash had pushed the metal downward, trapping her. I'm getting you out, he said, voice firm. Reaching inside, he pushed against the dashboard, trying to shift it just enough for her to move. But it was jammed tight. Daniel's breath misted in the freezing air as he searched the wreck. Then he spotted it. A crowbar. Reaching through the broken window, he grabbed it. His fingers burned from the cold as he wedged the metal bar between the door and the frame. Then he pulled. The metal groaned, resisted, then gave way with a sickening screech. But as it snapped free, Daniel lost his balance. The crowbar slipped from his grasp. He fell backward, crashing into the frozen ground. A sharp pain shot through his shoulder. For a moment the world spun. Snow soaked through his jacket, the icy burn sharp against his skin. His right hand throbbed. A jagged cut ran across his palm, blood seeping into the snow. But he didn't have time for pain. Shaking it off, he pushed himself up and climbed back toward the SUV. The door was finally loose. He grabbed it and yanked it open the rest of the way. Victoria gasped, her body trembling. I can't, my leg. Daniel leaned in. I need you to move, Victoria. Just a little. She sucked in a breath, wincing as she shifted. The metal scraped against her jeans as she pulled her leg free. Daniel reached in and wrapped an arm around her. Come on. I got you. She nodded weakly, trusting him completely. With one final effort, he lifted her out of the wreck. Victoria let out a sharp cry as her injured leg shifted, but Daniel held her steady, half carrying her through the deep snow toward his truck. They had made it out. But they weren't safe yet. Daniel gently eased Victoria into the passenger seat beside Lily, who was still wrapped in blankets. The little girl's eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. Victoria let out a shaky breath. Thank you. Daniel didn't answer. He was already moving, slamming the truck door shut and jumping into the driver's seat. The storm had reached its peak. The wind howled, the road ahead barely visible through the swirling snow. But they had no choice. They had to get to the hospital before it was too late. Snow lashed against the windshield, thick and relentless. The wipers barely made a difference as Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The storm had turned brutal. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the truck as it barreled down the narrow mountain road. Visibility was near zero. But stopping wasn't an option. In the passenger seat, Victoria was pale, her leg propped up awkwardly. Pain flickered across her face, but she was holding on. In the back seat, Lily lay bundled in blankets, still too quiet. Daniel flicked his eyes toward the rearview mirror. She needed warmth. She needed a hospital. No. Hang on, kid, he muttered under his breath. Just a little longer. The road ahead was barely visible through the thick snow. Daniel's truck tires crunched over ice, threatening to slide with every turn. He kept both hands steady on the wheel, his focus razor-sharp. One mistake and they wouldn't make it. The minutes dragged. The drive that should have taken 20 minutes felt like an eternity. Then red lights ahead. A roadblock. Daniel's stomach clenched as he slowed down. Through the blizzard he could just barely make out flashing emergency lights. A multi-car pileup. Several vehicles had collided on the icy road, leaving wreckage scattered across both lanes. A few figures, rescue workers in reflective gear, moved between the cars checking for survivors. Daniel clenched his jaw. They were blocked in. A man in a heavy coat approached his truck, raising a flashlight. Daniel rolled down the window just enough to hear him over the storm. Roads closed, the man called out. There's ice and multiple wrecks up ahead. No way through. Daniel's heart pounded. I have an injured woman and a child in critical condition. The man hesitated, then gestured toward a paramedic. A young EMT jogged over, shining his flashlight inside the truck. His eyes flicked from Victoria to Lily, then back to Daniel. Nearest hospital? Daniel demanded. The EMT didn't hesitate. 3 miles past the wreck, but you're not getting through this roadblock. Best option. Take the old service road. Daniel's pulse spiked. The service road. It was an old, rarely used back road that wound through the forest. A risky, unplowed path that hadn't been maintained in years. But it was their only shot. Daniel made a sharp turn onto the snow-covered trail. Immediately, the truck lurched, tires struggling against the deep snow. Is this safe? Victoria asked, her voice tight with pain. Daniel didn't look away from the road. No. But it's our only choice. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck as they weaved through the dark, narrow path. The headlights barely cut through the swirling snow. Every muscle in Daniel's body was tense. One wrong turn, one hidden patch of ice, and they'd be stranded in the middle of nowhere. Then through the storm, a faint glow ahead. The hospital. Relief surged through him as the truck finally skidded onto the main road, tires finding traction again. They had made it. The truck roared into the emergency entrance, coming to a rough stop. Before Daniel could even open his door, hospital staff were rushing toward them. The back door flew open and paramedics carefully lifted Lily from the truck. She was still too still, her small body bundled under layers of fabric. Hypothermia, one of the doctors murmured, checking her vitals. Get her inside now. Another team moved to help Victoria. She tried to push them away, shaking her head. Take my daughter first, she insisted. She's in good hands, Daniel reassured her, voice steady. Now let them take care of you. Victoria exhaled shakily, finally allowing them to lift her onto a stretcher. Daniel stood there for a moment, his body frozen, heart still pounding from the drive. Then he moved. Inside the ER was chaos. The storm had filled the hospital with patients. Car crash victims, people caught in the cold, more emergencies than they had hands for. A doctor rushed past, giving orders. We need more hands. Daniel barely hesitated. For the first time in 2 years he stepped forward. Tell me where you need me, he said. The ER doctor turned, eyes scanning Daniel for a moment. Then recognition dawned. Dr. Ford. Daniel gave a single nod. Let's go. And just like that he was back. The hospital halls were alive with movement. Doctors shouting orders, nurses rushing between rooms, stretchers being wheeled past. Daniel had spent years in this kind of chaos. But tonight was different. Tonight he wasn't just a bystander. For the first time in 2 years he was back in the trenches, saving lives. The ER was packed with patients from the storm. A nurse barely glanced at him before shoving a clipboard into his hands. Room 4 needs sutures. 5 has a possible fracture. And we need an extra set of hands in trauma bay 3. Daniel barely had time to process before muscle memory took over. He stitched wounds. Set a dislocated shoulder. Helped stabilize a hypothermic woman who had been stranded in the snow. Hours blurred. He didn't even realize how much time had passed until he finally stepped away from the chaos, running a hand over his face. And then he thought of them. Victoria. Lily. Without hesitation he made his way toward their rooms. Okayed up the moment Daniel walked in. Dr. Ford. Daniel hesitated. It had been a long time since anyone called him that. Just Daniel, he corrected. How are you feeling? She let out a breath. Like I got hit by a truck. But I'm alive thanks to you. Daniel shrugged, but she didn't let him downplay it. I mean it, she said softly. You saved my life. My daughter's life. Before he could respond, a small voice broke the silence. Mommy? Daniel turned. Lily was awake. Her tiny frame was curled under the hospital blanket, her face still pale but alert. She blinked up at him, confused. Then her gaze softened. You're the man from the snow. Daniel exhaled, tension he hadn't realized he was holding easing from his chest. Yeah, he said, stepping closer. That was me. Lily stared at him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She reached out. Daniel hesitated, then carefully took her tiny hand. It was warm now. Alive. And for the first time in years he felt something shift inside him. Victoria watched the exchange between them with something unreadable in her eyes. You're good with her, she said after a moment. Daniel let go of Lily's hand gently. Just lucky. Victoria tilted her head. I don't think so. There was something knowing in her expression, like she could see right through him. Then she took a breath. Daniel, I have to ask. Why did you leave medicine? Daniel tensed. She must have seen it in his face because she quickly added, You don't have to tell me. But I saw you tonight. You didn't just help us. You saved so many people in that year. You belong here. Daniel swallowed hard. Victoria wasn't the first person to tell him that. But coming from her, after everything, they carried weight. Come see us sometime, she said softly. Not just as a doctor. As a friend. Daniel met her gaze. Then for the first time in a long time he nodded. Maybe. Just maybe. He wasn't done saving lives yet.